I never thought I'd find myself driving through the pre-dawn darkness of suburban Calgary at 5 in the morning. But insomnia has a way of making decisions for you. At 67, sleep had become something of a luxury I couldn't always afford. My mind had been restless for weeks, circling around my granddaughter Emma like a worried hawk. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but 3 decades as an emergency room nurse had taught me to trust my instincts when it came to children in distress. Emma had just turned 12, and I'd been planning to drop off her birthday present later that day. A beautiful art set, the kind with real quality brushes and professional-grade colored pencils. My granddaughter was deaf, had been since birth, and she'd discovered that art was her way of speaking to the world. Her drawings were extraordinary, full of emotion and life that sometimes took my breath away. But lately, when I'd seen her, something in her eyes had dimmed. That spark, that joy she usually carried, seemed muted. My son Michael worked brutal hours as a long-haul trucker, often pulling 16-hour shifts to make ends meet. After his wife Rachel died in a car accident 4 years ago, he'd been lost, drowning in grief and single parenthood. Then he met Kyle. Kyle seemed like a godsend at first. Confident, established, a successful real estate agent with a nice house in the suburbs. He swept into their lives like a savior, offering stability when Michael desperately needed it. They'd gotten married 8 months ago, and Emma and Michael had moved into Kyle's house. I'd had my reservations from the start. Something about Kyle's smile never quite reached his eyes, especially when he looked at Emma. But Michael was so grateful, so relieved to have found someone, that I'd kept my concerns to myself. Maybe I was just being an overprotective grandmother. Maybe I was looking for problems that weren't there. But then the visits became less frequent. Michael was always apologetic when I called. "Emma's already asleep, Mom. You know how early she goes to bed on school nights." Or, "She's helping Kyle's nephews with a project. They're really bonding." Always an excuse. Always a reason I couldn't see my granddaughter. 3 weeks ago, I'd insisted on coming over on a Sunday afternoon. Emma had answered the door, and what I saw had made my heart clench. She'd lost weight. Her clothes hung loose on her thin frame, and there was a rash on her arms that looked angry and inflamed. When I'd asked her about it in sign language, she'd just shrugged and signed back that it was nothing. But her eyes, those expressive brown eyes that usually danced with mischief, looked hollow. Kyle had appeared then, all charm and white teeth, explaining that Emma had been having some allergy issues. Nothing to worry about, Margaret. We've got it under control. But something in the way he'd positioned himself between us, the way he'd hurried her out of the room, had set off every alarm bell in my head. So here I was, at 5:15 in the morning, pulling up to their house in the quiet darkness. I told myself I was just dropping off Emma's present early, that I wasn't being intrusive or overstepping, but deep down, I knew I was checking on her. I had to see for myself that she was okay. The house was dark, except for a single light in the upstairs hallway. I grabbed the wrapped gift from my passenger seat and walked up the driveway, my footsteps quiet on the concrete. The air was thick with that peculiar summer humidity that Calgary sometimes got, heavy and oppressive even at this early hour. As I approached the side door, I heard something that made me freeze. A cough, wet and rattling, the kind that speaks of congestion and difficulty breathing. It was coming from the basement window well, and it sounded painfully familiar. I'd heard that kind of cough thousands of times in the ER, usually from patients with respiratory infections or exposure to environmental irritants. I set the present down and crouched near the window well, pressing my ear close to the glass. Another cough, followed by a wheezing breath. My heart started to race. Was someone sick down there? Who would be in the basement at this hour? The window was at ground level, covered with a metal grate. I could barely make out anything in the darkness below, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw movement. Someone was down there. Someone small. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, angling it through the grate. What I saw made my blood run cold. Emma. My granddaughter was lying on a thin, stained mattress on the concrete basement floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes and storage bins. She was curled into a ball, her small body racked with another coughing fit. Her hearing aids were sitting on top of an upturned plastic storage container, the closest thing to a nightstand in that barren space. And the walls, oh God, the walls were covered in dark spots, mold. Extensive mold growth, the kind that forms in damp, poorly ventilated spaces. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. This wasn't a bedroom. This was barely habitable space. This was where you stored Christmas decorations and old furniture, not where you kept a child, not where you kept my granddaughter. I ran to the side door and pounded on it, not caring if I woke the entire neighborhood. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, I heard footsteps. Kyle opened the door, his hair mussed from sleep, wearing expensive silk pajamas. His expression cycled through surprise, annoyance, and finally settled on forced politeness. "Margaret, it's 5:30 in the morning. Is everything all right? Let me in." My voice came out harder than I'd intended, but I was past the point of niceties. "Right now." He stepped aside, probably too shocked by my tone to argue. I pushed past him and headed straight for the basement door. He followed, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "What's this about? You can't just barge in here." "Where does Emma sleep?" I asked, my hand already on the basement doorknob. "What? She sleeps downstairs. We've set up a nice space for her." I yanked open the door and flipped on the light switch. The basement stairs led down into a dimly lit space, and the smell hit me immediately. Musty, damp, the unmistakable odor of mold and mildew. I descended the stairs quickly, my nurse's training taking over, cataloging every detail. The basement was unfinished. Concrete walls, exposed pipes, no windows except for the small ground-level ones that barely let in any natural light. Most of the space was filled with storage, boxes stacked haphazardly, old furniture covered with sheets, paint cans, and tools scattered around. And there, in the far corner, was Emma's room, a thin mattress on the floor. No bed frame, no proper bedding, just a worn comforter that looked like it had seen better days. Her hearing aids on the storage container, a small pile of clothes in a cardboard box. And on the wall behind her makeshift bed, she'd taped up drawings, dozens of them. Colorful pictures that stood in stark contrast to the gray, moldy walls. Pictures of flowers and butterflies, of sunshine and birds. Pictures of the world she wished she could be living in. Emma was sitting up now, squinting at me in the dim light, her expression confused and frightened. Without her hearing aids, she couldn't hear the commotion upstairs. I climbed down and quickly moved to her side, kneeling on the concrete floor. Up close, she looked even worse than I'd thought. Her skin had a grayish tinge, and that rash on her arms was definitely an allergic reaction to something. The cough I'd heard earlier had left her chest heaving with the effort of breathing. I pulled her into my arms, feeling how thin she'd become, how her ribs pressed against my hands. She was trembling, and I realized it wasn't just from being startled awake. It was cold down here. In the middle of a Calgary summer, this basement was damp and cold. Kyle had followed me down, and his presence behind us made the space feel even more claustrophobic. "She's fine down here," he said, his voice tight. "She doesn't need much space. She's deaf, so it's actually better for her. It's quieter, no distractions." I slowly turned to face him, still holding Emma. "This is an unfinished basement. It's cold. It's damp. There's mold growing on the walls. This isn't a bedroom. This is barely suitable for storage. You're overreacting. Emma's perfectly healthy. She has a respiratory infection. Look at her. She's wheezing. That rash on her arms is a classic allergic reaction to mold exposure." I stood up, putting myself between him and Emma. "Where's Michael?" "He's asleep upstairs. He worked a double shift yesterday. He won't be up for another few hours." Kyle crossed his arms, his jaw set. "And before you go waking him up and causing drama, you should know that Emma is fine with this arrangement. She actually prefers it down here. It's her own space, away from the noise of the household." The audacity of that statement, the sheer calculated cruelty of it, took my breath away. He was using my granddaughter's disability as an excuse for neglect, as if being deaf meant she deserved less, needed less, as if isolation and dampness and mold exposure were somehow benefits rather than abuse. "Emma prefers this?" I turned and gently tapped Emma's shoulder, getting her attention. She'd reached for her hearing aids, fumbling to put them in with shaking hands. When they were in place, I signed to her. "Do you like sleeping down here?" She glanced nervously at Kyle, then back at me. Her hands moved slowly, hesitantly. "It's okay. Is it quiet down here?" "Sometimes." She paused. "Sometimes I hear water dripping, and I feel cold at night. Do you want to sleep down here?" Her face crumpled, and tears started to slide down her cheeks. Her hands moved jerkily as she signed. "Am I too difficult, Grandma? Kyle says I need my own space because I'm different. He says I'm lucky to have any space at all because I don't contribute to the household. I try to be good. I do all my chores. I stay quiet. But maybe I'm just too much trouble. Something inside me broke. This beautiful, talented, loving child had been convinced that she deserved this, that her disability made her a burden, that sleeping in a moldy basement was a privilege she should be grateful for. I pulled her close again, feeling her small body shake with sobs. Over her head, I looked at Kyle with an expression that must have communicated every ounce of rage and disgust I felt, because he actually took a step back. "Get out of the way," I said quietly. "I'm taking her upstairs. We're going to wake up Michael, and then we're going to have a very serious conversation about what happens next. You can't just—" "I absolutely can." I stood, helping Emma to her feet and wrapping the worn comforter around her shoulders. "I'm a mandatory reporter. As a former healthcare professional, I'm legally obligated to report suspected child abuse. What I've seen here constitutes neglect and child endangerment. So, you have two choices. You can let me take Emma upstairs right now, or I can call the police and CPS from down here. Your choice. You have 5 seconds to decide." He stared at me, his face flushing red with anger, but after a long moment, he stepped aside. I guided Emma up the stairs, one hand on her back, feeling the way she leaned into me like a lifeline. We emerged into the main floor of the house, and the contrast was staggering. The main level was immaculate. Hardwood floors, modern furniture, artwork on the walls. Everything spoke of money and taste. We passed the living room with its large flat-screen TV and comfortable leather couches. Then we passed what Kyle called his home office, a spacious room with a mahogany desk, built-in bookshelves, and a window overlooking the backyard. Next to it was the game room. I could see through the open door, a pool table, a vintage arcade machine, a comfortable seating area with beanbag chairs. 2 twin beds were set up on one side of the room, made up with fresh linens. "Whose beds are those?" I asked Emma. She signed back, "Kyle's nephews. They come every weekend. They're 10 and 14. They like the game room. Every weekend." So every weekend, these boys came and stayed in comfort while Emma was relegated to the basement. While they had beds and entertainment and space, she had concrete and mold and isolation. I felt my anger crystallize into something sharp and focused. I helped Emma into a chair at the kitchen table and then marched upstairs. I found the master bedroom easily enough and knocked loudly on the door. No response. I knocked again, harder. Finally, I heard movement. "What the hell, Kyle?" My son's voice was groggy and annoyed. "It's not even 6 yet." I opened the door. "Michael, get up. We need to talk. Now." He blinked at me in confusion, propping himself up on his elbows. "Mom? What are you doing here?" "Downstairs. 5 minutes. Get dressed." I didn't wait for a response. I went back to Emma, who was sitting at the table, the comforter still wrapped around her, looking small and lost in the bright, perfect kitchen. Kyle had followed me upstairs and was now standing by the counter, his arms crossed, his expression stormy. "This is ridiculous. You're being completely dramatic. Michael is going to back me up on this." "We'll see," I said coldly. Michael appeared a few minutes later, wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt, his hair sticking up in several directions. He looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from working too hard for too long. When he saw Emma wrapped in her comforter, then looked at me standing there with my arms crossed, confusion flickered across his face. "What's going on?" "Where does Emma sleep?" I asked him directly. "In the basement. Kyle set up a space for her down there." He looked between us, clearly trying to figure out why this was suddenly an issue. "Why?" "Show me," I said. "Right now. Take me down there and show me where your daughter sleeps." Something in my tone must have gotten through to him because he didn't argue. He led the way to the basement, and I followed, watching his face as he took in the space. Really took it in, maybe for the first time. His steps slowed as he descended. I saw the exact moment when he registered the smell, the dampness, the cold, the moment when he saw the mattress on the floor, the moldy walls, the complete absence of anything that could be called a proper bedroom. "Jesus," he breathed. "How long has she been sleeping down here?" I asked. "I don't know. Since we moved in, I guess." Kyle said it was temporary, that we'd fix it up properly, make it nice. He said Emma wanted her own space, that she was happy down here. He ran a hand through his hair, looking stricken. "I work so much. I'm gone before she wakes up, and I don't get home until 10 or 11 most nights. Kyle said she was already asleep. I just trusted him. Come upstairs. Back in the kitchen, I positioned Michael so he had to look at Emma. Really look at her. At how thin she'd become. At the rash on her arms. At the exhaustion in her eyes. Emma, I said out loud, making sure she could see my lips and signing simultaneously. Tell your dad where you sleep. She looked scared, her eyes darting to Kyle, but I nodded encouragingly. Slowly, her hands began to move. I sleep in the basement, on a mattress on the floor. It's cold at night, and sometimes water drips from the pipes. The walls are wet and smell bad. I have to use the laundry room bathroom, but sometimes Kyle locks the basement door at night because he says I wander around too much. Michael's face had gone pale. He locks you down there? Emma, I continued gently. What about Kyle's nephews? Where do they sleep when they visit? In the game room. They have beds and the TV and all the games. Kyle says they're guests, so they get the good room. And how often do they visit? Every weekend. Her hands moved faster now, the words spilling out like she'd been holding them in for too long. Sometimes they stay longer during school breaks. They're nice to me sometimes. But Kyle tells them not to play with me too much because I'm different. He says I need to earn the right to be part of the family. He says I don't contribute enough. Contribute? Michael's voice cracked. She's 12 years old. She's a child. What the hell does that even mean? Kyle finally spoke up, his voice taking on a reasonable, almost condescending tone. Michael, you know how hard it's been adjusting to having Emma full-time. She requires a lot of attention. She needs special accommodations. The basement arrangement just made sense from a practical standpoint, and she never complained about it. She's been sleeping in an unfinished basement with mold growing on the walls, while your nephews get the game room? Michael's voice was rising now, anger overtaking his shock. And you've been locking the door so she can't come upstairs at night? What kind of sick? I've been trying to teach her independence. You're gone all the time, Michael. Someone has to actually parent her and set boundaries. She needs structure, discipline. She needs a proper bedroom. She needs heat and clean air, and to not be treated like she's less than human because she's deaf. Michael turned to me, and I saw tears in his eyes. Mom, I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know it was this bad. I know you didn't, I said, keeping my voice steady even though I wanted to scream. You've been working yourself to death trying to provide for her. You've been exhausted and grieving and trying to hold everything together. And Kyle took advantage of that. I turned to Kyle, who was still standing by the counter with his arms crossed, his expression now defensive and hostile. You told Michael that Emma wanted to be down there, that she preferred it, that she was happy with the arrangement. You used her disability to justify neglect. You made her believe she was a burden. You isolated her from her father. And you locked a 12-year-old child in a cold, damp basement at night. You're twisting everything. I'm a registered nurse with 30 years of emergency room experience. I know neglect when I see it. I know the signs of mold exposure. I know what a respiratory infection looks like. And I know enough law to understand that what you've been doing constitutes child endangerment. I pulled out my phone. I'm calling my friend Sandra, who works at the urgent care clinic. Emma needs to be examined this morning. She needs documentation of her condition, including that rash and her respiratory symptoms. The mold exposure needs to be on record. You're overreacting. Try me, I said flatly. Just try me and see what happens. Michael was kneeling in front of Emma now, signing to her. Even without understanding ASL fluently, I could see the desperation in his movements. The way he kept touching her face, her arms, checking her over like he couldn't believe what he'd let happen. Emma was crying, and so was he. I made the call to Sandra, explaining the situation in clinical terms. She told me to bring Emma in immediately, that she'd make sure everything was documented properly. When I hung up, Kyle was standing by the window, his jaw clenched. This is going to look bad for you too, Michael, he said. You're her father. You're the one who's supposed to protect her. CPS is going to wonder how you didn't notice your own daughter living in squalor. It was a low blow, and I saw it land. Michael flinched, but I stepped in before he could spiral. Michael didn't know because you actively hid it from him. You manipulated his work schedule. You lied about Emma's whereabouts and her condition. You isolated him from his daughter. I moved to stand next to my son, but he knows now, and he's going to do the right thing. Michael stood up, and I saw something shift in his expression. The shock and guilt were still there, but underneath it, I saw steel. The same steel that had gotten him through Rachel's death, that had kept him working brutal hours to support his daughter. "Emma's not staying here another night," he said. "Mom, can she stay with you?" "Of course. She can stay as long as she needs to." "Like hell she is," Kyle snapped. "This is still my house. I'm still her legal step-parent. You can't just take her. Watch me." Michael's voice was quiet but carried an edge I'd never heard before. "You've been abusing my daughter, neglecting her, making her feel like she's worthless. That ends today. I never abused her. I never hit her. I gave her a place to sleep. You gave her a concrete floor in a moldy basement while children who aren't even yours got proper beds," I interjected. "That's neglect. That's psychological abuse. That's using her disability as an excuse to treat her as less than. And if you think any judge or CPS worker is going to see it differently, you're delusional." The argument continued for another 20 minutes, Kyle alternating between defensive justifications and outright hostility. But I'd made my position clear, and Michael was finally seeing the situation for what it was. Emma was going home with me. Today, right now. I helped Emma pack her few belongings into a bag while Michael went to get dressed properly. The entire time, Kyle hovered in the doorway, throwing out threats about custody battles and defamation. I ignored him. I'd dealt with angry family members in the ER for 3 decades. I knew how to keep my cool under pressure. By 7 in the morning, we were in my car. Emma was in the back seat, still wrapped in that worn comforter, clutching a paper bag filled with her clothes and her art supplies. The art set I'd brought for her birthday was on the seat next to her, still wrapped, a small bright spot in an otherwise dark morning. Michael followed us in his truck. We went straight to the urgent care clinic where Sandra was waiting. She took Emma back immediately, and while I sat in the waiting room with Michael, he finally broke down, completely, shoulders shaking, hands covering his face, making sounds like his heart was being ripped out. "I failed her," he kept saying. "I failed Rachel. I failed Emma. What kind of father doesn't notice his own daughter is being abused?" I put my arm around him. "This man who was my son but who suddenly seemed so young and lost. You were lied to. You were manipulated. Kyle took advantage of your grief and your exhaustion and your trust. That doesn't make you a bad father. What makes you a good father is what you're doing right now. You're standing up for her. You're protecting her. You're making it right. How do I make this right? How do I come back from this? One day at a time. Starting today." Sandra came out 45 minutes later with Emma and a thick file of documentation. Emma's examination had revealed mild respiratory infection, skin irritation consistent with mold exposure, signs of malnutrition, and elevated stress hormones. Everything was documented, photographed, and recorded. Sandra had also put in a call to CPS as a mandatory reporter, though she assured us that given the circumstances and the fact that Emma was now in my care, it was unlikely Michael would face any serious consequences. The focus would be on keeping Emma safe and holding Kyle accountable. We went back to my house, a small but comfortable bungalow in a quiet neighborhood. I'd raised Michael here, and after my husband died 10 years ago, I'd stayed. It was too big for one person, but I'd never been able to bring myself to downsize. Now, I was grateful for the extra space. Emma could have the guest room, the one that still had some of Michael's old things in it. It wasn't fancy, but it had a proper bed, a window with curtains, and no mold. Emma had barely said anything since we'd left the clinic, signing only when directly asked a question. She seemed shell-shocked, unable to quite process everything that had happened. I made her a proper breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast with jam, and watched her eat. She was so thin, too thin. Her clothes hung off her frame, and I could see her collarbones too prominently. Michael sat with her, trying to communicate in the basic ASL he knew. He'd learned some when Emma was younger, but he'd gotten rusty, and now he seemed frustrated by his inability to fully express what he needed to say. He kept signing sorry over and over, his movements clumsy and desperate. Emma reached out and took his hand, stilling his frantic movements. She signed slowly so he could understand. "It's not your fault, Dad. Kyle was mean to you too." That broke him all over again. Over the next week, things moved quickly. Michael filed for divorce immediately, citing child endangerment and requesting full custody of Emma. He also filed for an emergency protective order against Kyle, prohibiting him from any contact with Emma. I'd connected him with a family lawyer friend who specialized in cases involving child welfare, and she was handling everything with fierce efficiency. CPS did conduct an investigation, but as Sandra had predicted, it quickly became clear that Michael had been a victim of manipulation rather than a willing participant in neglect. The investigation shifted focus to Kyle, and what they found was damning. Neighbors reported that they'd heard Kyle yelling at Emma, calling her stupid and useless. Emma's school counselor revealed that Emma's grades had dropped significantly over the past 6 months, and she'd seemed increasingly withdrawn. The physical evidence from the house, including photographs of the basement and the mold growth, spoke for itself. Kyle tried to fight the divorce proceedings, tried to claim that he'd been a loving step-parent and that I'd poisoned Michael against him. But the evidence was overwhelming. The medical reports, the photographs, Emma's testimony, given through an ASL interpreter in the family court, the testimony of neighbors and school staff. His own nephews even confirmed that Emma had been kept in the basement while they'd stayed in the game room. The divorce was finalized within 3 months, which was remarkably fast by Canadian standards. Michael got full custody of Emma, obviously. Kyle was ordered to pay child support, despite having no biological children of his own. The house, which had been in Kyle's name but which Michael had contributed significantly to through mortgage payments and renovations, was sold. Michael used his share of the proceeds to put a down payment on a small 3-bedroom house, just 15 minutes from my place. But the legal proceedings were just the external framework. The real healing happened slowly, in small moments. Michael adjusted his work schedule, taking a less lucrative route that meant he was home 5 nights a week instead of 2. It meant less money, but he was adamant. "I can't buy back the time I've lost with her," he told me, "but I can make sure I'm present for the time we have now." He started taking ASL classes at the community college. 3 nights a week, for 2 hours, he sat in a classroom with other adults, learning to sign. He practiced with Emma constantly, signing at dinner, signing during their evening walks, signing while they watched TV together. His movements were still awkward and slow, but he was improving. And more importantly, Emma could see that he was trying, that she was worth the effort. They moved into their new house 6 months after that horrible morning in Kyle's basement. It was small but sunny, with a bedroom for Emma that had big windows and a closet for all her art supplies. Michael let her pick out the paint color, a soft lavender that made the room feel calm and peaceful. They hung her drawings on the walls, dozens of them, transforming the space into a gallery of her inner world. I helped them set up the house, and on moving day, I found Emma standing in her new bedroom, just looking around with an expression of wonder. I tapped her shoulder, and she turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Her hands moved slowly. "Is this really mine? All mine?" "Yes, baby. All yours. And I can stay here? I don't have to go back to the basement?" I knelt down so we were eye level, taking her hands in mine. "You're never going back there. You're never sleeping in a basement again, unless it's a finished, warm, safe basement that you chose. You're never being locked in. You're never being told you're a burden. You're home now. This is home." She threw her arms around me, and we stayed like that for a long time, her thin body pressed against mine, her tears soaking into my shirt. The respiratory infection cleared up within 2 weeks of proper treatment. The rash took a bit longer, but with prescription cream and being away from the mold exposure, it eventually faded. Emma gained back the weight she'd lost. Color returned to her cheeks. The hollow look in her eyes gradually filled with something brighter. But the psychological healing took longer. She had nightmares. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, terrified, convinced she was back in the basement. Michael would hear her through the baby monitor he'd installed, and he'd rush to her room, turn on the lights, and sit with her until she calmed down. He'd sign to her over and over, "You're safe. You're home. I'm here." She struggled with anxiety around Kyle's nephews' ages. If she saw boys who were 10 or 14, she'd freeze up, waiting for them to tell her she wasn't allowed to play or that she was different. It took months of therapy with a counselor who specialized in childhood trauma and deaf children before she started to relax around other kids. There were also sessions with a family therapist where Emma and Michael worked through what had happened, where Emma could express her hurt and anger at her father for not noticing, for not protecting her, where Michael could apologize properly, not just with words, but with changed behavior, where they could start to rebuild trust. I attended some of those sessions, helping to facilitate communication, offering perspective as both Emma's grandmother and someone who'd seen the situation from the outside. The therapist emphasized something that I tried to reinforce whenever I could. What had happened wasn't Emma's fault. She hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't too difficult. She wasn't a burden. She was a child who deserved love and safety, and the adults in her life had failed to provide that. But now they were working to make it right. Kyle faced legal consequences too. He was charged with child endangerment, a criminal offense in Alberta. While he didn't serve jail time, he did receive a suspended sentence, probation, and a significant fine. He was also required to attend parenting classes and anger management, though since he no longer had any children in his care, it was mostly symbolic. More importantly, the court issued a permanent restraining order. Kyle was prohibited from coming within 500 meters of Emma or attempting any contact with her. His real estate career took a hit too. Word spread in the community about what had happened, and several clients dropped him. His reputation was damaged, and within a year, he'd moved to a different city, trying to start over somewhere people didn't know his story. I can't say I felt sorry for him. Michael's journey was its own story. He struggled with guilt for a long time. Some days he'd show up at my house, and I could see it written all over his face. The shame, the self-recrimination, the constant loop of how did I not know? How could I let this happen? I'd make him tea, and we'd sit in my kitchen, and I'd remind him of the truth, that abusers are skilled manipulators, that Kyle had specifically targeted his vulnerabilities, his grief over Rachel, his exhaustion from work, his desperate need for stability. That isolation is a classic abuse tactic, and Kyle had systematically isolated Emma while making it seem reasonable and normal. You were working 16-hour shifts, I'd tell him. You were barely keeping your head above water. You trusted your partner to care for your daughter, which is what you're supposed to be able to do in a marriage. Kyle lied to you. Repeatedly, he hid the truth. He manipulated situations. He took advantage of Emma's disability to justify his behavior. This isn't on you, but I'm her father. I should have noticed. I should have insisted on seeing where she slept. I should have paid more attention. Yes, I'd agree, because there was no point in lying. You should have, and now you are. You can't change the past, Michael. You can only change what you do moving forward. And what you're doing now, the way you've stepped up, the way you're fighting for her and learning for her and being present, that's what matters. It took him a long time to forgive himself. I'm not sure he ever fully did, but he learned to live with it, to channel that guilt into being the best father he could be moving forward. As for Emma, she flourished, slowly, carefully, like a plant that had been kept in the dark, finally brought into sunlight. She began to bloom. Her artwork became even more vibrant. She joined an after-school art program for deaf and hard-of-hearing students, where she finally found peers who understood her experience. She made friends, real friends, who came over to the house and stayed for dinner and signed with her and didn't treat her like she was different or difficult. Her grades improved. Her teacher reported that she was more engaged, more confident, more willing to participate. The hollowness in her eyes was replaced by curiosity and joy. She started to laugh again, a sound I'd almost forgotten. She couldn't hear her own laughter, but she could feel it, and watching her throw her head back and giggle at something silly Michael had signed was like watching a miracle. One evening, about a year after everything had happened, I was over at their house for dinner. It was a Sunday, and we'd made it a tradition to have Sunday dinners together. Michael had gotten better at cooking, and tonight he'd managed a decent roast chicken with vegetables. Emma had made a salad, carefully chopping cucumbers and tomatoes, her hearing aids in place so she could listen to music while she worked. We were sitting around the table, Michael signing enthusiastically about something that had happened at work, Emma signing back with corrections to his grammar, both of them laughing, and I looked at them, my son and my granddaughter, in this small, sunny house, and I felt something settle in my chest. They were okay. They were going to be okay. After dinner, Emma pulled out her sketchbook and showed me her latest project. She was working on a series of drawings depicting what she called her two lives. The first set showed the basement, dark, closed in, lonely. The second set showed her new bedroom, bright, open, full of color and life. The contrast was stark and powerful. My art teacher says I should enter these in a competition, she signed. For young artists dealing with trauma, do you think they're good enough? I looked at the drawings, at the raw emotion captured in every line and shade, at the journey from darkness to light, at the resilience and strength of this remarkable young girl. They're more than good enough, I signed back. They're extraordinary, just like you." She smiled, that brilliant smile that transformed her whole face, and went back to her sketching. Michael caught my eye from across the table and signed, "Thank you." Just those 2 words, but the weight of them, the depth of gratitude and love, was immeasurable. I signed back, "Family takes care of family." Because that's what we do. That's what we're supposed to do. We protect each other. We stand up for each other. We notice when something's wrong, even when it's hard, even when it's inconvenient, even when it means confronting difficult truths about people we thought we could trust. I thought about that morning, driving through the darkness at 5 a.m., following an instinct I couldn't quite name. If I hadn't trusted that instinct, if I'd waited until a more reasonable hour, if I'd talked myself out of checking on Emma, how much longer would she have suffered? How much more damage would have been done? I'd worked in emergency medicine for 30 years, and I'd seen the consequences of adults not listening to their instincts about children. I'd seen the cases that came in too late, the injuries that could have been prevented, the trauma that could have been minimized if only someone had acted sooner. But I'd also seen the cases where someone did act, where a teacher noticed bruises and made a report, where a neighbor heard something concerning and called the police, where a family member asked hard questions and didn't accept easy answers. Those were the cases that ended better. Not perfectly, because trauma doesn't just disappear, but better. If there's anything I learned from this whole experience, it's the importance of trusting your instincts when it comes to children's welfare. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If a child seems withdrawn, anxious, or different than usual, there's probably a reason. If you're being kept away from a child or given excuses about why you can't see them, that's a red flag. And for parents, especially single parents or parents in new relationships, please be vigilant. I understand the desire to trust your partner, to believe that they have your children's best interests at heart. But some people are very good at hiding their true nature. Some people see vulnerable children as inconvenient obstacles, rather than human beings deserving of love and care. Watch how your partner treats your children when they think you're not looking. Listen to what your children tell you, whether with words or signs or behavior. Make time, even when you're exhausted, even when work is demanding, to really see your children, to check in on them, to make sure they're safe and happy and thriving. For children with disabilities, this vigilance is even more crucial. Disabled children are statistically more likely to experience abuse and neglect than their peers. Too often, their disabilities are used as excuses for mistreatment. They're difficult. They require too much. They won't understand anyway. They can't tell anyone. These are the justifications abusers use, and we as a society need to reject them completely. A disability doesn't make a child less deserving of love, safety, and proper care. It doesn't make them a burden. It doesn't give anyone the right to treat them as less than human. Emma's disability, her deafness, was used against her by Kyle. He used it to justify her isolation, to claim she needed less space and attention, to suggest that she somehow preferred being kept separate. These were lies, cruel manipulations designed to hide his neglect. But they were lies that played on existing societal prejudices about disabled people. And that's something we all need to work to change. Emma is thriving now, but I know the scars from those months in Kyle's house will never completely disappear. She'll always carry some wariness, some anxiety about new situations and new people. She'll always have to work a little harder to trust that she's safe and valued. That's the legacy of abuse. It doesn't just hurt in the moment, it echoes forward, affecting how a person sees themselves and the world around them. But she's resilient. She's strong. She has a father who loves her fiercely and who shows up for her every single day. She has a grandmother who will always be watching out for her, ready to drive through the darkness at 5 in the morning if that's what it takes. She has a therapist who's helping her process what happened and build healthy coping mechanisms. She has friends and teachers and a community that values her. That morning in Kyle's basement was one of the worst moments of my life. The shock and horror of seeing my granddaughter in those conditions, the realization of how long she'd been suffering, the gut-wrenching knowledge that we'd all failed to protect her. It's an image that still haunts me sometimes, but it was also the beginning of her healing. Because that was the morning everything changed. That was the morning the secret came to light. That was the morning we started to make things right. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd ignored my instincts that morning. If I'd waited. If I'd talked myself out of driving over there at such an unreasonable hour. If I'd decided to respect boundaries and not intrude, Emma would still be in that basement. The abuse would have continued. And eventually, maybe, someone else would have noticed. Or maybe they wouldn't have. Maybe it would have gone on for years, compounding the trauma, deepening the wounds. I can't change what happened to Emma during those months, but I could change what happened after. And that's what I chose to do. I chose to act, to intervene, to refuse to accept easy explanations and comfortable lies. I chose to put Emma's welfare above social niceties and family harmony. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Because at the end of the day, children are the most vulnerable members of our society. They're dependent on adults to keep them safe, to advocate for them, to see them and hear them and value them. When adults fail in that duty, for whatever reason, other adults need to step in. That's not being intrusive or dramatic or overreacting. That's being human. That's being responsible. That's being the person a child needs in their darkest moment. Emma is 12 now, turning 13 next month. She's planning an art show at her school, displaying her 2 Live series along with new work she's been creating. Michael is learning how to help her set it up, how to hang artwork properly, how to create good lighting. He's as nervous about it as she is, which makes her laugh. I'll be in the front row at that art show, watching my granddaughter share her story with the world, watching her transform pain into beauty, trauma into art, darkness into light. She's braver than I ever was at her age. She's stronger than she knows. And she'll never sleep in a basement again. She'll never be told she's too difficult or doesn't contribute enough. She'll never be made to feel like her disability makes her less deserving of love and dignity. Because we won't let that happen. Her father won't let that happen. And her grandmother, who still sometimes wakes at 5 in the morning with that old instinct, that old sense that something isn't right, will always be watching, always be ready, always be there. That's what family does. That's what love means. We show up, we pay attention, we act, and we never, ever stop fighting for the people who can't yet fight for themselves.